How did you meet Gopi Krishna?
Well, it's strange to say, and most people chuckle when I say it, but he actually appeared to me in a dream on New Year's Eve, 1969. And all that happened in that dream was that I was walking down a riverbank. I don't know where it was, but I noticed a man on the opposite shore motioning to me to come over, to cross over. And I looked to my left and I saw what appeared to be a tree stump or a post or whatever with two steel cables crossed and dipping into the river and coming up on the opposite shore. So I waded into the river and took hold of the two cables and pulled myself across and walked the 20 steps or so from the bank to the man. And as I stared into his, or gazed into his eyes and he into mine, a very, very large voice, a very, very loud voice boomed out from above. "This is Mr. Krishna." That was all that was spoken. Then he turned to his right and began walking alongside the river. And I followed him at 5-10 feet behind, and as he then waded into the water, I followed him, and when we got to be about waist deep, he turned around and took me into his arms and gave me a kiss. At that point I woke up, wiping my lips off with my hand. I had never experienced a kiss from a man before, and I was very embarrassed, and that was the end of the dream. Then I happened to know a woman in Canada. Her name was Sylvia Hellman, and we had become very good friends just corresponding. She had made a trip to India under similar circumstances, not the same, but she was a professional dancer actually from Nazi Germany, but after the war, she decided to immigrate out of Germany to wherever she could be invited, and it was Canada, so she came to Canada and set up a dance studio. And she used to rent it out a couple of nights a week to a group of Buddhist who had meditation classes or sessions. And while she was waiting for them to leave one night, so she could lock up, which was her way of doing it, she suddenly had a vision of a man, and the next day, while in the bookstore in a town called Nelson, she saw a book with that picture on it, and it was of a Swami in India. I can't remember his name, but he had been a medical doctor, and he set up an ashram after he retired in Rishikesh. And she wrote him a letter and telling him what happened, how she had seen his picture on a book. And he wrote back and he said, "Yes, it is time you came home to India." So she did. And while there, she met a documentary filmmaker who was also spending some time in India, named Leslie Shepard. And they became good friends. And when she returned to Canada and he returned to London, that was the end of their association, except one day a very well-known publisher in London called him and said, "Look, we've received a manuscript from a man in India that is so weird and so strange to us, even though they had been publishers of occult literature for over 70 years. The name of the company was Stuart Watkins. And they knew that Leslie had just come back from a stay in India, and so they called him and said, "Leslie, would you be able to assess the value or the validity of this manuscript because it's way beyond our knowledge and our experience. And he said, yeah, go ahead and send it over to me. So he read it. The name of the book was Kundalini, the Evolutionary Energy in Man by Gopi Krishna. So he read it, and although it was very, very strange, even to him, he said it's absolutely valid, and I recommend you go ahead and publish it. Well, Leslie had actually received 2 copies. So one he sent to the publisher to read it, and the other he sent to Sylvia Hellman. And after she read it, she wrote me a letter and said, if you ever wanted to know what it's like to be enlightened, I'm going to send you a book by a man who is enlightened. And I just want to say that though enlightened, he suffered a lot. And when the book came, it was the one I told you about. And so when she wrote to me, she said, I'm going to send you this book just in case you're interested. And I said, by all means, send it. And I read it, and I thought, here's a man who, if anyone needed help insofar as getting his books published, because I didn't know at that time he had a publisher, because she sent me the Indian edition that had been published. A friend of Gopi Krishna's in India offered to have it printed for him, not published. They just printed a small number, and all but 2 or 3 ever left the printer's warehouse because they didn't know what to do with it. So it's very strange that one copy ended up in my hands via Leslie Shepard and Sylvia Hellman, and the other ended up at the publishers. So I wrote Gopi Krishna a letter, and I said, I found your book very interesting, and if you're in need of someone to try and get your book published in the United States, I'd be very happy to try. And he wrote back and he said, well, he was hoping somebody would contact him, and we began a correspondence. And I was in the advertising business then in New York City. I had left an advertising company in Des Moines, Iowa, and I just thought I should be in New York because that's where I thought most of the action would be found. But I didn't know why I would go to New York. I just took it upon myself to try. And so when I wrote to him, I had actually written to him and said, look, I'm in the advertising business and I'd like to write a pamphlet describing more or less what you want the public to know about your idea to scientifically research the target of yoga. What is yoga all about, other than reaching a state of bliss or relaxation, which was all the rage at that time. And I said, but I'm trying to write this pamphlet based on what I've read in your book, but it's just not coming out. I simply cannot do it. Would you be so kind as to just write a few pages that I could publish as a pamphlet? And he wrote back instantly saying that it was a coincidence, but he had been asked to give a talk in Florence, Italy, at the yoga center there. And he said, I intended to speak extemporaneously, but since you've asked to have it written down so you can publish it, I will ask my friend who has a typewriter and who will type it up, and I'll write it in handwriting tonight because I'm leaving in a day or two. So I was really delighted because I just saw that it was going to be important. Mainly what struck me then is that he's giving a speech in Florence, Italy, and what occurred to me is that that's where Galileo wrote his principle of two world systems, which changed the history of the world. And I thought anything this man, Gopi Krishna, writes is going to do the same thing. And now this coincidence that he's doing it in Florence. So I was all anxiety and eagerness to get this manuscript. And in 10 days or so, it takes 10 days to get a letter out of India in those days. They come faster today. And so I opened the packet, and here was a manuscript rolled up of 18 pages. And I counted the words, and it was about 18,000 words. About 1,000 words a page, because it was in elite type. And we don't even have elite type anymore, but it's much smaller than the typewriter. It's much smaller than 12 point. It's more like 9 or 10 point.
Wow. And
single space with no margin on either side. And how am I going to put this in a pamphlet? My God. And I read it over and I thought, I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to even edit it. I don't even know if it needs editing. But I better do something with it. And I happen to know the chief copywriter at the New Yorker magazine. We used to have lunch about every 4 or 5 weeks. And next time I had lunch with him I called him, as a matter of fact, and said, let's have lunch. And I said, I have this manuscript, I don't know what to do with it. I don't know if it's publishable as it is. To me it reads fine, but what should I do? And he said, well, give it to me and I'll give it to my top copy editor. So about a week later he came back to me and he said, it's fine as it is. My top copywriter said there's nothing he can do about it. It's the way it ought to be. And I was really startled because I couldn't believe anybody could write that many words that didn't need editing. So I turned it over to a typesetter as it was, even though I thought, I counted one sentence that ran 130 words. And I thought, there's nobody going to be able to untangle that sentence. But if the New Yorker copy reader said it's as it should be, I'll let it go. And then I didn't publish the book then. I got it set in type. Well, then my wife, Chloe, said, I can't understand why you would go to all this trouble and expense to publish a book from a man you've never met.
That's okay. We can hear you.
All right. So I said, well, I don't really have to meet him because I'm going strictly on what he puts down on paper, and I like very much what he's written, so I want to publish it. And she says, well, why don't you go to meet him? As long as he's in Europe, how long will he be there? And I said, I don't know, but I'll find out. And I found that he would be there several weeks. So I immediately applied for a passport, which I didn't have, and went over to meet him. And I took the galley proofs along with me. And I said, now, I'm ready to go to press with this, but I don't know what we should call it. There's no title on it, and there are no chapter headings. And I can remember we were walking up some wooden stairways to an apartment in a small apartment building. And he stopped a few steps above me and he said, well, he turned around and said, you can call it whatever you like. And I said, I've tried to pick a name for it. I don't know what to call it. He said, well then, why don't you call it The Biological Basis of Religion and Genius? And I said, that's perfect. That's terrific.
Yeah.
And then he said, and then why don't you break it up into smaller chunks like chapters? And I said, okay. He said, and then he just rattled off the titles of 3 chapters, or 5 chapters, which I don't have I think the first chapter was entitled "The Short Fall of Religion," but I don't know the others. But I just have to go grab a book, but I don't want to do that right now. So we decided, okay, we'd do it, and I used to be a newspaper editor, and I just wanted to get it out like a news story because I just had it in my guts that it was important. So I think we printed 5,000 copies and about 3,000 in hardcover and 2,000 in softcover. And we mailed out 1,450, or about that many, to names that I had gotten just by going through lists. Editors, publishers, scientists, and scholars whose names I selected, not at random, but as best I could, thinking that they were, I mean, how would I know who to send it to? I just sent it. But I know that was that quantity. And my wife came in, and one of my sons came with her. I was in New York that time, and we had an office in New York, and she was living in Connecticut. So they came in with the van. We had a Ford van to help me put all the books in mailing boxes and typing up the labels and taking them to the post office. Well, it was 11 o'clock that night before we got them all packed away in the van, and we drove down to the main New York post office on 33rd Street and drove in the back where all the big trucks come in with mail. And the guy said, "Hey, what are you doing with those?" And I said, "Well, I want to mail them." And he says, No, we don't take any mail after 8 o'clock unless it's first class mail, and you're sending these book rate." And I said, "Well, what am I going to do with them?" He says, "You bring them back tomorrow, 8 o'clock. I said, "Well, we live in Connecticut. I got to drive all the way back to Connecticut and then bring them into New York." I think it was a Friday night. And he said, "Yes, that's what you're going to have to do." So we drove out of the station, and I stopped at one of the mailboxes on the street, and I stuffed maybe 10 in there because they were all jammed full. And we went up and down Park Avenue, Madison Avenue, Fifth Avenue, Third Avenue, dumping 5, 10, because they were all filled. You could only get 5 or 10 in a mailbox. We got rid of the 1,500.
Wow.
I think we went into Harlem and everywhere. And the next morning I get a call from the post office department. He said, What's going on with you?" And I said, "What do you mean? What?" He says, "You're mailing all those boxes last night." I said, "Well, yeah, I wanted to get them in, and the post office, or the main post office, didn't accept them." He says, "Well, you can't do that." I said, "Well, what should I do now?" He says, "Well, don't do it again." So that's the story. I guess they got all delivered, but I have no idea whether they got delivered or not, because frankly, we had a return address envelope in there they could write for additional literature, and we only got two inquiries. One, I'm pretty sure, was Dr. Gene Houston, and the other was I know for certain, was John White, and both have become my friends ever since. John especially has done an awful lot to get out the same message contained in The Biological Basis in Religion and Genius.
So when this book went out in your midnight postal drop in Manhattan, then somehow or another it got over to Harper and Row. Is that correct?
Well, then it did, but it was not through my effort. Gopi Krishna had met Professor Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, perhaps the most prestigious or highly regarded scientist in Germany at that time. He was a protege of Werner Heisenberg and had been one of the leading figures in science in Germany to talk Hitler out of completing a nuclear bomb. A lot of people think he was working on the bomb, but that was not sure. That was not a fact. He was doing everything he could to waylay the production, or not production, but the completion of an experimental bomb. And finally he met with Hitler and said, we can build a nuclear bomb, but not before the war, not before Germany loses the war. There's no way you can expect that. So there's no need to continue this race to produce one. We can't do it that fast. And so all the effort then went into Werner von Braun's project, the U-2 or whatever it was, V-2 missile. But even today, a lot of people think Weizsäcker had something to do with building the bomb, but he did not. So, then he offered, out of the generosity of his heart, to write an introduction to the biological basis of religion and genius. And once Ruth Nanda Anshin, the editor at Harper and Row, heard about that, then she just jumped at the chance, because she was such a widely read woman and knew so many people, popes, and Jonas Salk was one of her closest friends. Einstein was a very close friend of hers. And once she heard that Friedrich von Weizsäcker was going to write an introduction, she jumped at the chance to become the person who acquired it for Harper and Row. At the same time, Gopi Krishna had a manuscript ready to go called The Secret of Yoga. And Dr. Anshin wanted to publish that simultaneously, which is a matter of historical record. They both came out at the same time, The Biological Basis of Religion and Genius, with Weizsäcker's introduction, and The Secret of Yoga, which was a more scholarly book. And it's still in demand today. So that's about all I can say about those two books.
So, over time, you developed this incredibly close relationship with Gopi Krishna.
Yes.
And you had access to all of his writings and in copious letters that he wrote you from time to time. Quite a library of information that you have as part of the Kundalini Research Foundation. And then all the books got published. There's a total of 13 books in all, is it?
Well, I would say, better to say 18 books.
Wow.
And enough information, enough other writings that could make another 2 books. And perhaps we will do that. And then he made a great number of audio tapes from events. He came to the United States twice. Once in 1978, when he stayed here at our home, and once again in 1979. He had to come back because he had been invited to speak at a symposium, not a symposium, but a conference put on by the Sufi Order of the West, headed up by Pir Vilayat Khan at the Statler Hotel in New York. And he spoke there. And then he came back in 1983 to speak at the United Nations to a special meeting of the Native American elders at the UN. And I have that speech. It was taped, but I wasn't the person to tape it, but I have a transcript of it. But altogether, I would say we could put together another 3 books. But frankly speaking, I think for the present, Kundalini has spent its momentum. It had a little while, maybe 3 or 4 years, when there was a lot of interest in Kundalini, but it has waned considerably. So I think it's almost a dead issue
Wow.
for the moment. It will pick up again, but not at the moment.
So there is a core to what Gopi Krishna wrote, and it's about, one of the titles of his book is Kundalini, the Evolutionary Energy in Man. Is that right?
That was the first book published,
Yeah.
the first.
So as I understand it, what he was saying was that this Kundalini energy, which is a reversal of the energy in the body, up the spinal column to the brain, is the way evolution gets activated in a person, and in that process it changes the neural structure of the body. Is that a fair way to describe that?
That definitely is, with probably one caveat, which is the brain is in a state of organic evolution. It's really peculiar, but in 1971, I don't think there was a scientist in the entire planet that would agree that the brain is in a state of evolution. Now, I believe that 50% of all biologists and physiologists and perhaps even physicists say, of course the brain is evolving. Why shouldn't it continue to be evolving? But you know, that's how much change has taken place in just 30 years. From total negativity to almost total acceptance. Now, how that came to be, I have no idea. I'd like to think that Gopi Krishna had a hand in it, and perhaps future historians will be able to trace. But we don't know at this moment. But I know how things get around so quickly. I mean, you put it on the internet now, and it can get around very, very quickly. But those were the days when you had to do everything with a typewriter and a piece of paper and a postage stamp. Now you can't get a letter written. I mean, they even poke fun of people who use postage stamps. I mean, I think it's for the worst, frankly, that we can communicate so quickly because it's so superficial. Yes, we have Wikipedia, but you can almost always find a lot lacking when you go researching, and you don't know for certain on Wikipedia whether it's true or not, because so many people write what they want, and there's no gate that can say, hey, this is nonsense or this isn't true. I mean, if you read Wikipedia to find out about Gopi Krishna, there's a very little. The main reason is no one, including myself, has really taken the time to write a well-composed entry in Wikipedia, whereas there are other people who are 100% phony, 100% totally erroneous and phony, who can have 3 or 4 pages on Wikipedia with their whole curriculum vitae and everything they've ever dreamed of spelled out there. You think, well, that person is a Nobel Prize winner, when actually that person is already forgotten. And I would name names, but I don't want to.
So this business of the Kundalini energy as a evolutionary trigger, even though it's becoming more accepted in scientific circles, is still a lightning bolt of an idea, isn't it?
The moment it is accepted by recognized scientists, it will have the impact of a nuclear bomb going off in Bombay, psychologically.
Well, one of the things we've been discussing with scientists along the way on this journey is that 100 years ago, Niels Bohr said that consciousness has the power to change the outcome of experiences. Just a peak inside a particle experience causes waveform dysfunction, and it changes the outcome of the experiment. And he went on to say that consciousness is more powerful than any of the things we're experimenting with or discussing, and yet science has resisted even looking at consciousness. And here we are now, and we're talking about a component of that, which is that Kundalini is part of the vehicle of how consciousness works. Is that a fair thing to say?
Well, I'd hesitate to say that's the way it works. What I would say is that Kundalini is the channel through which universal consciousness, which permeates every animate and inanimate object in the universe, does not generally circulate within the human brain until you awaken Kundalini, that channel. And thereby I say this: every human being who we call a genius was born as a genius. But if you trigger Kundalini and raise it to the brain, you become a genius whether you are just an ordinary person or not. It is the biological basis of genius, which is the first thing Gopi Krishna ever wrote. Not the first thing he ever wrote, but the first thing he ever wrote that I asked him to write. And that stands as 100% dogma today. I can't see where it's ever been contradicted. It's just that it's hard to grasp, and people don't want to spend the time thinking about it. They start yawning if you bring it up and the implications of it. And scientists in general are too busy to deviate from their specialty. When Gopi Krishna visited Germany, he'd meet scientists, and they would laugh at the idea of scientific specialization, because specialists in any branch of science generally nowadays are so narrow-minded they can't deviate from what they learned at Harvard or wherever they went and got their degrees. It's very difficult to find a highly specialized scientist who can speak coherently about somebody else's specialty. You go into a doctor now and say, well, you might have a problem with your liver. I don't know. I want to send you over to Dr. Mickelson. He specializes in liver ailments. And everybody knows that now. You have to go to one or two or three doctors before you find the one who specialized in what's happening in your body. Mm-hmm. And that's the same in physics, the same in philosophy, well, a little less in philosophy, but all the other branches of science. So who specialized in Kundalini? Nobody. There was nobody specializing in Kundalini, and there still is no scientist conversant with Kundalini. Therefore, Kundalini does not exist. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So the only way you can get a scientist to deviate from what he is trained in and what he makes his living in is to be rich enough to buy his time. And that's why I say it's useless to go from one scientist to another begging them to take a look at this new specialty. You're better off to write a letter to Bill Gates and pray that he gets it. But chances are 1 in 1,000 that he'll ever get a letter written to him, unless it comes through his secretary and through her, the number of other barriers to reaching him. And I'm not saying that is anything bad about Bill Gates. It was no doubt the same with Stephen Jobs, no doubt the same with any other businessman or successful thinker. They just don't have the time to look into anything else.
Yeah. But because this is such a powerful idea, and it's almost a revealed idea.
It is.
That its time will come, and somebody will understand that we have to do this. So One of the things that we have heard from other scientists we've been talking to is that evolution is like a quantum field, and every decision you make or every step that's taken by evolution, things become more complex, but it also opens up an endless series of gateways which one could never predict where they would go. And yet, as I understand Gopi Krishna, he is saying that even though that might be the mechanical basis of how evolution works, there is a target for evolution. We're going someplace. What's that about?
Well, consciousness is intelligence, and it's universally admitted that we are evolving, and that evolution broadens our intelligence. That's why I say that it's possible for an ordinary person to become a certifiable genius. Gopi Krishna is a prime example. I've invited innumerable people to just look at his body of work and say, prior to his awakening Kundalini, he was an ordinary government clerk in a small office in Kashmir, never writing more than a paragraph or two as a letter to some citizen who came to the government to complain about a road that need repaired or something. He would write to him and say, we'll look into it. Now, that was pretty good as a measurement of his intelligence. I would say he probably had an IQ of 110, but he didn't have an education beyond a rural school. But once Kundalini raised to his brain, knowledge began to flow through him. He likens it to a well in which the water comes from a long distance underground to come surface. That's the same as consciousness. It's everywhere, but the brain is shut off from universal consciousness. The brain then, once you awaken this energy, the channel opens and universal intelligence begins to flow through. Now, the best examples, I believe, are what we call autistic savants. We're just bowled over the fact that just an ordinary guy can get in a helicopter and be flown over Rome for 20 minutes, and he's just gazing out the windows. I don't say an ordinary person, but a seemingly ordinary person. But this, I mean, there are examples of what I'm saying. They were on 60 Minutes and there are many other shows, so people do remember. And when he lands, they put a canvas in front of him, 360-degree canvas, maybe 8 feet high from the floor, and he can sketch quite accurately everything that appeared before his eyes as he flew over, including if it's 12 columns in front of a building, he paints 12 columns. If the building has 28 windows, he sketches 28 windows. The whole of Rome, he did that, and many other examples of that. And then there are young children, 3 and 4 years old, that can't even utter a sentence, even a word, and their parents give up on him, and the therapists give up on him, saying I'm afraid he'll never develop into any more than he is now. And then somebody says, or the kid happens to be looking around the room and he sees a keyboard of a piano or something, and he crawls over there and all of a sudden starts playing something as complex as Mozart. This happens so often. I wouldn't doubt if you went to 60 Minutes producer and said, do you have any lined up for next fall? Oh yes, there are 3 or 4. We got one from Sri Lanka, one from Bombay, and another one from Toronto, Canada. They're all amazing, so amazing we can't even begin to understand. Well, they can easily understand that they are genius in a very, very tiny part of the brain. An illuminated human being, illuminated woman, illuminated man, like Gopi Krishna, could be facile in 50 languages in 1 year of exposure to those languages. He could be a mathematical genius given 6 months of instruction. He could be a medical doctor capable of knowing about many, many different illnesses and diseases with just a little coaching. Gopi Krishna had none of that and didn't seek it out. He was a penniless person. He had no money to even help him learn any language, and yet the first booklet he ever wrote was written in 9 languages, of which 5 he had never seen written, never seen printed, never heard spoken. Persian, I don't know, but we have booklets anyone can write for him called, I don't even remember the title, but we have them in the basement. That's the first thing that happened to him. He was crossing the Kwai Bridge in Srinagar one day, and he said suddenly he stopped and he uttered 4 or 5 lines of poetry. And he just said, I was as startled as if all of a sudden I had the formula for a new cancer cure. But that's what happened to me. He just suddenly started writing. And I now that I'm thinking about it, I think we should republish it because I think a lot of people would be interested in it. A lot of them don't believe it in the first place. They say, now Weizsäcker read it and he was amazed. All his comment was, his poetry in German isn't too great. But it was simple verse in German. And he had no idea what German sounded like, nor what it looked like in print. And the same for several other languages. So what I'm saying is, all that knowledge exists in the universe, in consciousness. Now you flood your brain with that same consciousness as it flows in. I say flows in. It merges with your individual consciousness and you become a genius. If you had any specialty whatsoever, if you had a specialty as a doctor, let's say, and you were specialized in cancer, and you awakened Kundalini and brought it to your brain, you would come up with a cancer cure post-haste, without a question of none. You would. That's why it is so vitally important for the survival of the human race that scientists become interested in this phenomenon.
Well,
nothing is more important. Nothing whatsoever is more important.
When you describe the possibility of this and the access one would have to profound, deep, revolutionary information, it seems like that anyone would want to have this experience to get access to this, literally, its power. And anybody would want that. So how does one get it?
If I were Gopi Krishna sitting here, I know what he would say. Grace is number one. What is grace? I don't know if it's described in an encyclopedia. It would just be so, it would be thousands of words trying to capsulize the essence of what is grace. But it's divine. It's a gift. We can't say we know how to earn it even. But all the religions of the world tell us the first step. And the first step, I suppose, would be to develop as best you can compassion and all the other qualities that people admire in others. Try to develop those, and at the same time ask the Almighty to look favorably upon you. Even that is not a guarantee, because look at all the saints. Look at all the individuals who've practiced all kinds of self-deprivation, gave up everything just to become enlightened. Very, very few ever became enlightened. Gopi Krishna spent 17 years, from the age of 17 to the age of 34, concentrating his mind every day from about 3 a.m. to 3 to 6 a.m., 3 hours, 3 to 4 hours, every day. Even on his wedding night, he got up at 3 in the morning or 3:30 and went to the temple to take a shower because they didn't have running water, and then went into a little room and concentrated his mind on the idea of a lotus flower. It could have been it could have been a rose, it could have been the idea of God, whatever, but he just chose that because he wasn't instructed. And then suddenly, like a sound of the roar of a waterfall, he felt this energy rushing from the base of his spine into his brain, and he went into cosmic consciousness. And that, he describes it better than any person has ever described cosmic consciousness in the written language. We don't know of anything printed worldwide that describes the phenomenon of enlightenment or cosmic consciousness. And why don't we have it in all the literature? Because it's that rare. There are cosmic conscious people. I mean, Walter Russell from Minneapolis, but he had talent before. He did practice sculpture and but he had a cosmic conscious experience which kept him up for 40 hours or more, during which time he created marvelous things. So there are examples all over the world. In fact, when I go online to some websites, there are a number of people who claim to have had the same experience. But I would say in every single case, they were born with a tinge of genius, but autistic generally. Like these autistic savants I'm talking about. They can't even operate in public, or they can't hold a job, or they can't do this or that. But they have this genius in their brain, but they can't harness it. But the phenomenon is there. It could be studied. There are many people that could be studied, and they'd all have a common source. I don't know what it'd be, but I would be willing to bet quite a lot of money that I don't have, that if you went into mental institutions and interviewed all the schizophrenics there, you would find that they'd all relate to what I'm talking about. Suddenly they would start perking up and say, yes, 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 you know, whereas you can't get a medical doctor or a psychologist to even do that. There, you know, Gene Houston's husband, Robert Masters, well, he knew about as much as anybody about the sexual drive of a human being. He studied that. And when Gopi Krishna mentioned to him that this should be done, psychologists should specialize and go into the mental institutions and talk to these schizophrenics about just what I'm talking about now, they would have a huge amount of interesting reactions. Then they would all come back and say the one common denominator of all of them was this connection with their sexual energy. And Robert Masters said, well, I'm sure we've done that. And after a few months of him checking it out, he says, no one's ever done that. So no one of any specialty has taken Gopi Krishna seriously. Really. They either want to suppress what he's said, suppress what he's written, or they want to belittle it in order to praise their own guru. That is the biggest obstacle to enlightenment, the fact of jealousy. Anybody who expresses the idea that he became enlightened will be denigrated and suppressed.
Yes, because it seems so impossible to us.
Not only that, it's jealousy, vanity, and ego are the three pillars that support the suppression of this knowledge.
So let's go on the slightly to the left of that place and talk about what can our viewer do right now if they are interested in accessing this power. What can they do to start the process? It might take 20 or 30 years, but you have to begin the journey at one step at a time. What will they do?
Well, the first thing they shouldn't do is start meditating. Everybody thinks you have to meditate. Meditate, 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 meditate. I never heard of a person other than Gopi Krishna who became enlightened just by sitting down and meditating. They don't know what they're meditating for. Okay, if I set out now to go to Des Moines, Iowa, and I've never been there before, and I say to myself, I am absolutely not going to use GPS, or I'm not going to look at a map. The chances of getting to Des Moines are pretty slim. But everybody thinks all I got to do is learn how to meditate, and I have a chance to become enlightened. Well, what is it? What is enlightenment? I don't know. I don't know. So how are you going to get enlightened if you don't know the target? Well, I mean, we did that, didn't we? Didn't we try that experiment? I know you two know about it. People teach meditation like gods, and they couldn't even describe in 500 words what it means to become enlightened, or what is cosmic consciousness. They'll say, well, cosmic consciousness, I don't know. Well, you're teaching meditation every weekend, aren't you? Yes, of course, I've learned to meditate. Well, have you become cosmic conscious? No. What is it? I don't know. Isn't that ridiculous? It is ridiculous, but it's universal.
So if somebody wants to make this path, and you're saying that uninformed meditation is not going to work, what will work? What can they do right now today?
Well, I would say read the lives of some of the saints, like St. Teresa, St. John of the Cross. Just read their lives, and you'll get a kind of an idea of what it was that brought them to that state. Like St. Francis, what did he do? He ran off to do good works, right? And what about Mother Teresa? I mean, she didn't openly say, I want to become enlightened, but you know that the reason she became saintly and self-sacrificing and to help the underprivileged and the sick and the poor, she had a goal in mind, and that is to become nearer to God, right? Nearer to Jesus. Well, that's the first step. Pray for grace, because that's the key. The divine power can select anyone for enlightenment, and it helps if you consciously go after it. I have a book here that we just published called Secrets of Kundalini in Panchastavi. And when I met Gopi Krishna face to face for the first time, he said, Mr. Kieffer, if we're going to work together, there's one project I'd like to have us make as our priority. I said, what's that? And he said, well, there's a little booklet that was written by an enlightened man more than 1,000 years ago who lived in Kashmir. And it's never been translated from its original Sanskrit, except perhaps in a local dialect here. But outside of the Kashmiri Valley, it's not known, even by scholars. He said, I'd like to translate that into English and we should publish it. I said, well, absolutely, let's do it. I said, what would it cost? And he said, well, it would cost, I would say $500, because I'd like to have the Sanskrit rendered by a calligrapher. And we'd have to pay some lady who can write that Sanskrit in that manner. And I said, well, let's do it. So it took him 2 years because he was busy and traveling and stuff. And he sent me 2 pamphlets with the Sanskrit and his English translation. And then nothing more happened. Then we published a little more elaborate booklet in India alone, which had an introduction with it that he wrote, about 50,000 words. And after he died, then I began to think, I said, you know, we've never really done that first project the way it should have been done. So I published this. And it has the original Sanskrit and his 50,000 word introduction, which is a masterpiece in itself. You don't have to go past the introduction to learn more than you could learn in 4 years at a college. More important. And he said, this is one of the 5 most important books in the world. And I just passed that off as I couldn't even begin to think why he would say that until I began to read it myself over and over again. And everywhere in here, it has the words of the divine speaking. And it just says, those who love me, I make a genius. How can you become clearer than that? Those who love me who? The divine. I will make a genius and a world teacher. But then you could say, well, how come you're not a genius? Well, I have to read it more. I don't think you can read it too often. It's just, but really, a yoga teacher in California, in San Francisco, gave me the names of 5 of her colleagues, all who taught yoga for upwards of 20 years. And we gave each one a copy of this book. And very few of them said anything. But those who said something said, I can't understand it. Now, it's absolutely plain English and not even very obtuse. And yoga teachers who've been teaching yoga for 25, 30 years couldn't understand it. So what is that to say? I don't know what to say about it. I have no idea. All I say is, if you want to become enlightened, study it. And if you want to study Gopi Krishna's books, they're available through Amazon.com and through many other companies.
Let's pause just a second. We're going to reload tape here.
Hi, thanks for watching the first part of this 2-part interview with Gene Kieffer. We're so pleased to have you share this information because this truly is a remarkable interview, just in the logistics of getting it. The second part follows in the second video, which we are publishing at the same time. If you'd like to get a hold of Gene Kieffer, you can do that by emailing him at polaris77@seashore.com. So stay tuned. Please join us at the second interview, and thank you so much for watching this.